sounds like everything's good.
Okay, cool. Hopefully that
The,
fixes it.
and the
But
audio's
yeah, I'll
better
try.
for you.
Yep, if anything pops up, maybe I'll just try and message you in the chat or anything. But yeah, fingers crossed that will be all good now.
Yeah, I'll you know what, for that, just in case, I'll open up. And the thing is I've got like the recording time, so worst case is if I have to like I'll just write down the time that it was, and I'll cut out like any intermittent. Well, I've had to do it before, so it's not a big deal. But yeah, I'll keep Discord open on my phone because I full screen it on here so I can capture the footage. Um,
Yep, yep,
but we all good to restart then?
yep. We're all good. Okay.
Okay. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 59 of the Chadcast. We are joined today with a wonderful guest, an employee of LSS, somebody who I think you've been on maybe a couple podcasts, possibly, or was that Carol that was on? I know he was on a couple recently. But today we are joined by Kieran McIntyre, who is I believe you're a developer of the game, like you're actually one of the
Yep.
people making the cards. You are also very involved in the earliest meta of Flesh and Blood, the Welcome to Wraith meta at the very beginning. So I would love to hear about that. You were also one of the earliest content creators for Session Blood, which was a competitive based podcast. I'm assuming you had to stop once you started working for the company because it's probably, a little conflict of interest or something there, or just didn't have the time. But I am very glad that you're here to join me. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. And yeah, you're right. I work as a game dev at LSS these days. Carol and I did a podcast called Session Blood way back in the day, back when there wasn't sort of so much amazing content around for Flesh and Blood. Just something for us to try, help spread the game, spread a little bit of knowledge that we picked up here and there. And it did become a little trickier once we joined LSS. Carol also has two wonderful children these days, so it's a little bit trickier for him to find the time between all the things he does, which is fair enough. He also did all the editing, so all I had to do was talk, and then he had to go fix it all up later. And yeah, so I've been on some podcasts here and there. Usually, if people ask me, I'm happy to do it. I kind of, like the sound of my own voice. I always like talking, so yeah.
Well, I imagine if you did a podcast before that it's something that you're just comfortable with doing, and I'm not gonna lie, even for myself, like it always feels nice when I get invited onto other things, because it's like, and kind of like you said, it's like, hey, I know I do it myself, but I get to go on, share my thoughts on somebody else's platform. I get to, talk to some new people, and I don't have to do any of the work of it. They do all the work. I just get to talk and then go about my day. So, I get to share my thoughts about a game I love, and I'm sure you feel very similar in that regards. So I guess just to start off, like, obviously I've asked Brian Gottlieb this as well about his job, and I know his position's a bit different, being like the senior designer. But what's it like doing your job? You don't have to give us any details about like new cards or that coming out in the new set. Although if you want to, tell us, I guess, your opinion on Part of the Mistveil and how you feel about that set, maybe that'd be great. But like, what's it like working for LSS?
Oh, mate, it's great. I turn up to work and get to play games most of the day. Like, what else could you ask for? But yeah, so just speaking generally about game dev, a lot of it is just around basically trying to make sure that that the product comes out in its best place possible. So, as you mentioned, people like James and Brian are very involved in sort of designing the cards. In terms of game development, I think our job is largely to make sure that stuff is, not just completely broken. When it comes out, it's quite fun to play. There's some cool decks out there. We obviously test for both limited and constructed formats. But yeah, a lot of it is, you turn up, you play a lot of games. We have, try and go through feedback processes. We're trying to constantly improve our dev process to be kind of as efficient as possible, make sure everyone's opinion is filtering through to people like Brian, and people like James, people like Chris Gearing, who, the senior devs. And yeah, that's largely it. It's quite cool because three of my closest friends since I was about 15 years old, Tom Penny, Carol, and Rohan also work on the dev team. So it's pretty nice being able to kind of turn up to work and play some games with your friends and all the other amazing devs as well.
That sounds like a pretty amazing time, and I'm assuming then that the atmosphere where you work is just super chill. Like, I imagine it's just like does it feel like you're just hanging out with your friends like on a day-to-day basis, or?
Yeah, like it can ebb and flow sometimes. It's definitely sort of crunch times a bit where things are a bit more serious, where we have to like really just drill down and get stuff done. But I think we definitely cultivate a pretty fun, pretty chill vibe. There's a lot of different like little in jokes in the dev team. We will just like yell out dumb stuff to each other all the time, and but yeah, I think we try and keep it like pretty chill, pretty relaxed, while also being like serious about like when we actually have discussions and debates about cards and whether sort of certain things need to change or whether numbers need to move here and there. Um, things could definitely get pretty heated. It's quite funny. Like I feel sometimes the people I may argue with the most, the three people I mentioned, my closest friend from years ago, when we were all on the dev team at the same time, at a certain point, we're like, oh wow, we actually might have quite a lot of influence here because the four of us, we all know each other quite well. So, we feel quite similarly about a lot of cards. So, if we make up four members of the dev team, blah, 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 and then it turns out that us four differ wildly a lot of the time with different cards anyway.
Well, and then I imagine you guys like bicker with each other, and there's almost because I've heard, I believe it was either James or Brian had said it, and I guess you can corroborate this, but like I've heard that you guys have almost like rivalries, like you very competitive with each other. Everybody wants to win as much as everyone else, and so I imagine that if like you guys disagree on cards, there's no pulling that other person on your side unless you guys argue about it like pretty rigorously, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure. I think people, I feel like definitely as we have grown into the roles as well, people are good at trying not to let like their personal opinion about something hold them back too much. So, I like to say I definitely voice my opinion strongly, maybe sometimes too strongly, but I do like to think that I'm happy to be proven wrong. Like if we're talking about like a critical thing and I have a pretty strong stance, if I hear sort of two or three or four other people put forward some what I think are quite good arguments as to why it shouldn't work, then I do my best to sort of take a step back and be like, you know what, I think you're right about this. We, in terms of rival when we're playing games, like for sure, particularly when you play against your friends from way back, you kind of always want to win. Sometimes the purpose isn't always about winning, it's just about discovering what certain cards do and how they operate in certain formats or in certain decks. But yeah, it's definitely what I like to call, we don't argue, we just have a robust exchange of ideas.
Mhm. Has there ever been a time where like you've noticed that a card interaction or the way that it was designed was either a little too, like let's say a little too broken for the state of the game, and that like other people didn't see and you kind of had to be the one arguing for it and get people to see your point of view? Or
Uh, Probably. I think I'm probably not even going to give a specific example. Like, I think it kind of goes both ways. Like sometimes we might pick up something that's maybe actually that some people feel is a little bit too weak, and sort of push a change just to make it a little bit stronger. There's definitely also other situations where, yeah, you're right. Sort of there's these little small interactions. Something's worded just, with some of the rules and everything, something's just worded in a certain way that it's a little bit off, and suddenly it opens up this massive combo, or someone spots an interaction, builds a deck, and everyone else is like, actually, yeah, that is too good, or like, we don't like the play pattern this presents. I feel I've probably done it at some point. I feel I'm probably not the main person always picking these things out. I feel like there's definitely people very good at that. I feel Jason Chung, I'm sure you've heard of him, one of the OG developers from way back. I feel he's got a good reputation for just finding the potentially broken stuff and like identifying it, and then he's saying like, hey, do you want to sit down and give me a game? I'm like, oh no. All right, mate, let's do it. And then he just crushes me on turn 3, and it's like, we should probably mention this to Crystal Brian.
yeah, no, I mean, it's good to have people like that though, because like I'm not an awful player, but I know I don't have the chops to develop. Like I just don't think I've got the perspective of it or the brain. I mean, maybe I think it's also. Do you feel that it's like once you enter the environment of designing cards that you improve at that just by being around a bunch of people doing the same thing?
I think, yeah, for sure. Like, particularly in terms of development, sometimes early on, like the goals of what developing a set are maybe different than the goals of what testing for a competitive tournament might be within like a team boot camp setting or whatever. Sometimes it's just not all about, we just want to find, if you're testing for a tournament, we just want to find the best deck, then we test all the matchups, and then we play these cards, and that's great. developing it sometimes about just you need to do vibe checks or feels checks or different power level things and seeing how the heroes coming up in the upcoming set, how do they play into all these different matchups, et cetera, et cetera. So, in terms of designing cards, that's more within the realm of the sort of designers, more like Chris and more like Brian and James. So, not that devs can never design cards, but I would say that's not really our primary job of designing cards to go into the set. We do get asked sometimes for suggestions and all that jazz, but I feel that's generally a bit more James and Brian's realm.
Okay, but so I'm assuming then though that you have designed or like at least created a card before then, like maybe a small handful or.
Me, I'm not actually sure. I feel there's maybe like one or two cards that have gone through a lot of changes that maybe I had an idea for.
Oh, okay.
There's one definite famous meme card that I try and sneak in to every set. I'm not allowed to say what it is, but that I try and sneak into every single set, and maybe it'll come out one day. But
Okay, so
no,
I guess everybody listening to the chatcast right now, everybody needs to go on Twitter and tweet at James White and tell him to free the mystery card. bring it to the game. Free the meme card specifically.
Yes, so there definitely are sometimes certain legendaries and majestic cards where sometimes someone has a really good idea and it sort of goes through the appropriate channels and then it goes people discuss it and then like maybe there's a spot for it in the set and it goes through. I know Carol has designed a few cards before that have made it through. I can't remember if he's mentioned them or not, so I'll probably just sit back and not say what they are for now. I don't think I've got like a really well-known card in from start to finish so far. I'm not sure design is necessarily my strength, but yeah, my one card that I sometimes push for in every set. I think it was funny because one time we're having a meeting talking about sort of the set in general, and like around expansion slots and stuff like that, and there was possible that there was a space left for a card, and I think Chris G was away that day, and I was like, hey James, what about like card X? And he's like, oh, that actually sounds kind of interesting. Like, maybe we could look at that. And we're talking about it. And I think Chris was like coming in through Zoom, and he's just like, absolutely not. But maybe in future.
Yeah, hopefully in the future. Can I ask, is it like specific to a class or hero, or is it just a generic card?
I probably can't say.
Okay,
Sorry.
Can't give away the secrets. Because it could be a card. Hopefully, it's a card we see one day. Because you sound excited about it, so hopefully that can come to light. Because and then you can kind of like put out on Twitter, just put a little like oh, the meme card is here, so people know what it is.
Yep, for sure.
That'll be your crowning achievement. So I guess the next thing to ask you about developing cards, just because we're talking about like your little meme card and everything, and I can't help but think about one Brody Spurlock's Silent Auction, I believe is what it was called, the absolute wall of text of a card, aka this game's Yu-Gi-Oh card, because it's just massive text. So what are your thoughts on that card?
It's it's an interesting one, right? Like there's a lot of text on that. It's like, do I have to bring out my magnifying glass and sort of really zoom in to read everything? It's definitely it's a cool card. It's a cool card. So yeah, I think the thing with the celebrational is that card will likely sort of find its way into print at some stage. I can't really give any sort of timelines of like when that will be or anything. That's more kind of like James and Brian's thing. But I think that's the type of card when you have kind of what you might call tutor effects, cards that can like search for cards in deck. Particularly, I believe the original version of the card, like a generic kind of uncap search for anything. Those type of effects can be a little bit dangerous, just speaking very broadly, when you're able to just, particularly in generic, when it's available to absolutely everyone. So, like I said, I can't really speak too much to the card exactly, but I imagine it will have to go through a bit of a thorough dev process in order to make sure like that try and keep the spirit and everything of it, but make sure it's reasonable for everything going forward.
Yeah, I believe that's what I'd heard about it, where when you guys are developing, especially for a card that a fan made, it's not about making their exact card. It's more about making what is the spirit of this card, like what is the goal of this card, and then translating that to something that actually works within the game's limits and doesn't, as you said, like being a generic, doesn't just break the game out, entirely. Because yeah, like the fact that anybody can use it and have the potential to tutor that, I can just think of a few decks that breaks immediately. I mean, Prism's, halo of illumination, being able to grab out a Figment at any time is very powerful. You give her another 3 copies of a Tutor effect, and that could be pretty wild.
Yeah, and particularly like I was mentioning in generic, it's just uh, when a card is maybe more siloed into like, for example, a certain class or a talent or both, you obviously have to consider what its effects are right now and what effects it might have on development going forward into the future when something else comes out that may also be able to play these cards, that sort of thing. So when it's in generic, it definitely amplifies that, because not only is it what does it do in every single deck right now, but what might it do in every single deck in the future, because when it's generic, everyone can play it.
Yeah,
So
is that
yeah,
like
I guess we'll just have to kind of see where that lands eventually.
is that like a struggle that you find with developing cards, just trying to like project into the future, as well as like I imagine as the card pool grows, and as more sets come out, it's going to get more and more difficult to actually test everything, because like in another 5 years, when we're on set like 25, you're going to forget about some random card from, I don't know, like Outsiders, that you just like you haven't touched in a while, and it, next thing you know, it kind of breaks something in the future. Is that like a worry that you guys have, or are you pretty on top of things?
Um, I wouldn't say sort of a worry necessarily. It's just something that we just need to be conscious of when going through things. So, maybe a card that we're testing seems okay right now, but then it's like, well, if we allow this card to go forward, does it restrict maybe design space and stuff going forward into the future? So I think, uh, you know, people like James, Brian, Chris, Jason Chung, who've been around for since the beginning for a very long time, I think that they are very good at identifying those cases and just sort of making a judgment call. In collaboration with everyone, like, what do we think about this? Are we okay with this? Are we concerned about what this might have to do in the future? So yeah, I wouldn't describe it as we're sort of constantly worrying about it, but we are conscious of this when we're going through and testing stuff.
Yeah, well, I think a great example of that is the recent banning of Berserk, where just quite straight up in the ban list says it's because it destroys or it hurts like future design. And then obviously the KO Armory deck comes out, and there's already a couple cards like the Savage Sash. Looks like it just absolutely breaks Berserk, because it's like all your stuff costs 1 less, and Berserk's just going to keep drawing you cards. So it's like, oh, okay, like that's like a 40 damage turn that you could generate there on like easily, if you just get a little lucky in what you draw off Berserk. So I can see that you guys, and even I know another good one was Stubby Hammers in Blitz was banned before Fi came out. So I do I and I know a lot of other Flesh and Blood players very much appreciate that you guys are on the ball and you're actually proactive, because I think it's understandable in a game where the only thing that really rotates are the heroes and their signature weapons. You're gonna have cards from the past that suddenly break future design, like just because it's like, oh, we never thought about this strategy back then. This card breaks it, and I imagine it's like, okay, well, that's if as long as the old card isn't something highly played or it's just like a common or whatever, you can just be like, okay, we'll just ban that so it doesn't break the new design, and then we can kind of go with the new design. And I appreciate that, rather than let's release a bunch of stuff, break the game, and we'll fix it in a few months after it kind of ruins the metagame for a little while.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I liked Brian's article when it came out mentioning stuff like Berserk and all that, and sometimes it isn't always strictly that this particular thing comes out, that you mentioned Berserk and Savage Dash, for example. And sometimes it might not always be like, well, yeah, this deck is just 100% into everything. It can never lose, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it might just be what I referenced earlier, like the feels or the vibes check, where, it's not necessarily absolutely 100% into everything, so it's not okay and can never exist. It's more, there might be a number of games where some of the more experienced people come in and they just kind of watch some of these games take place, and it's like, is this kind of really the Flesh and Blood experience we're wanting? I think Brian mentioned like games just being decided over I do the Berserk with the Savage Sash, and suddenly it's just, well, if all the cards off the top come right, then that's 95 damage, and, and you can't do anything about it. And like, yeah, sure, there's a number of big combos in Flesh and Blood, things like Kano ate the Wildfire, and things like Lumina Bolton and all that. Um, but I think there are sort of subtle differences in how some of these decks operate as well. So,
Mhm.
uh,
I was gonna say, yeah, the thing with Brute having Berserk is it's like they don't really have that much of a downside. They have a fridge of armor. Their decks are very consistent. Like if you put in KO, he can consistently deal damage, and because of I believe, yeah, because isn't it if Berserk flips something off the top? I think so. Doesn't KO's ability also? Yeah, it takes place on Berserk. It gives the +1. And then whereas like something like Kano, he's very weak with only 30 health. Everything requires blue pitch off the top. You have to kind of set it up. Sometimes you can get lucky, but a lot of the times Kano has to like Arsenal and Ether Wildfire, get a couple E-Pots on the field, and then they can go off. And I mean, Bolton is just like one of the most underrated heroes for his turn to turn average. And then he gets those big explosive turns because he's built up the soul. So it's like, I can see what you mean where, some heroes are combo, but there's a huge downside to playing that deck as well. Whereas with like Brood, it feels like Savage Sash Berserk is just like, you're not really getting the downsides of this. You just get this giant combo turn on top of everything else you already do, well. So
yeah, because I feel James did. I don't want to misquote him, so maybe I'll just try paraphrase. I believe he commented on some sort of Twitter post and saying pretty much exactly that for, Kano, yes, you can do these big things, but you have 30 life and almost no armor. So like there's this trade-off between your fragility and your output. Whereas something like KO, speaking generally, like you mentioned, when you've got like the flesh bag, your apex braces, scabbies, this, you start on 40 life. Uh, you can naturally just pump out a fair bit of damage anyway. There's a pretty clear distinction between how these two decks operate.
like if you can get lucky and land a Blood Rush Bellow and a Berserk in a single turn, then it's like there's no way you're losing at that point, you know.
Yeah, like I'm sure some people out there have, will probably have some fun trying the deck just like some kitchen table games. It's a big part of Flesh and Blood. Just
Living Legend.
playing at home. Yeah, living it like you play with your friends. You play casually. You see how the deck operates. I've definitely played this sometimes where we go through and develop stuff, and I just draw the absolute dream, and on turn 3 I'm like, oh, you're dead, sorry.
Yeah. That sounds like in the Living Legend format, I can see that being a deck. Maybe not the best deck because I imagine that it's not as consistent as some other ones. If you don't get the Berserk until like halfway through the game, well, the Chain player might have killed you because they've already banished 7 cards and they're throwing like a
Yep.
15 card hand at you. But no, I could definitely see that being something akin to almost Stubby's Fi in Living Legend, where like sometimes you just kill them within the first couple turns and you just high roll them. And I think that's good for the game though. I think especially for a format like Living Legend, maybe less so for CC, but the format that's like wide open, it's like, hey, there's a bit of variance where a deck can win on like turn 1 or 2 out of nowhere. Like I think that's okay. Maybe less for people
Yeah,
competing at the tournament, but
yeah, and like Living Legends where a lot of the wild stuff goes on, but there's all these extremely powerful things happening. But I think there's also a lot more tools available for players to try counteract some of these strategies. If I just think off the top of my head, things like Oldham, for example, you have your Stalagmite, which can maybe try ruin their day with a Frostbite timed at the right time.
Blizzard.
All sorts of different things. Blizzard, yeah, of course. I mean, Chain even has access to things like Husk, so if they can't pop off and fully kill you, maybe you get to do some great stuff back. But yeah, I agree. I think it's something for maybe people experiment with a bit of LL and have a bit of fun there.
So I guess shifting from the Living Legend format and even developing cards, I wanted to ask you and if you could like I guess kind of tell us. I guess the two things I want to know, one is kind of what was Welcome to Wraith, like the Welcome to Wraith Arcane Rising crew metas. I got in between Crew First and Monarch, but I was playing with friends, learning the game. We were playing very casually, so I didn't really experience the actual meta game of Crucible. I just we were just throwing cards. We were learning how to play the game, brand new. But you were around and competing in tournaments in the very early days. I know when I was looking back at the first like Road to 10Ks, all the very first like basically I imagine they were kind of at the level of Pro Quest, except everybody was brand new, so I imagine the skill level wasn't like through the roof at the time, because the game was still very fresh. And then obviously then it was the 10K calling, the very first calling Auckland. And I believe, did you come in second in the calling Auckland? I believe you came in second with Katsu.
I did indeed.
Not
It
control Katsu
sometimes
though.
no, I was playing the good old fashioned sort of mid rangey combo Katsu. It's definitely, sometimes when you come second place, still haunts you a little bit. I'm like, what could I have done differently to try and get that game? But yes, I did. I quite really enjoyed playing that tournament. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I guess kind of what I want to know then is both what was that like, what was the game like, even just in the community, like, what the meta was like, playing the game, the people, the experience, how much it's different from today, where like the game is so much bigger than it was back then. I mean, back then it was mostly Australia, New Zealand, and I think Taiwan and Malaysia were like the four areas the game really penetrated in the very early days before it came to the states and then started to spread all over the world. So kind of like what was that like, but also what like why did you get hired by LSS essentially? Like what kind of brought you into working for the company along with all of that?
I'm just such a
So
great
just kind
guy.
of like tell the story of like you're getting into you working for LSS, I guess, is the best way
All
to
right,
do
so
it.
this kind of like my origin story.
But I'll shut
Yeah,
up.
for sure. So, um, I tell the story a little bit on sort of podcasts or on the Station Blood one when I get invited, but happy to of course run through it. So, how we got into the game is all comes back to our good friend Tom Penny, who when Flesh and Blood sort of originally came out, I was living in a flat or like a sorry, it's a Kiwi term, I guess a share house. Basically, I was renting with some friends. We call it flatting here, basically. So I was living with Tom and Carol at the time, and Tom basically was like, "There's this new card game called Flesh and Blood. It's a Kiwi game. Like, I've been playing a little bit of Seal Deck. Do you guys want to play?" And Carol and I, we'd played a few other games. We'd played like, growing up, we'd played a bit of Magic and stuff like that in the past. But I think at that point we were kind of done apart from just playing casually. And we're like, it's a new card game. I don't know, man. But he was persistent. He like, bought a box and he's like, no, just, we'll just go play in the kitchen. It'll be fun. And eventually got Carol to try the game. And then I was walking past and I was just looking over. I'm like, oh, looks kind of interesting. And he's like, yeah, sit down. Like, I've already got the seal decks built up. I was like, okay, sure. So I still remember to this day my very first turn in Flesh and Blood ever. We were playing seal decks. I had Bravo, and he was just running me through the rules. I'm like, okay. I look down at my hand, and I get to go Slogism into Regurgitating Slog, turn 0 with Dominate. So I come in for whatever it was, like 11, 12 damage. And I'm just like, all right, this game seems kind of okay. And so then we played a bit more sealed that day. And I was talking about it with Carol. We're like, yeah, this game seems pretty fun, but it's probably just more of like a limited thing for us. Maybe we'll play like draft and sealed events here and there. And then 4 days later, I dropped like $400 buying all the Katsu cards. But we've got like my Mask of Momentum, my Spring Tunic.
Right?
Oh yeah. So I back then,
my goodness. So you made out like a bandit.
yeah. So back then I was like, man, am I really dropping like 130, $140 on this? Cold Foil Tunic like an equipment card. I'm like, everyone says it's a staple. Like, I guess why not? And so worked out pretty well. So bought all the cards and then just ended up. I think about a week or so after that, Carol and I ended up going on a road trip down to a city called Palmerston North. It's about a 7 or 8 hour drive. And so we went down there with a bunch of players you might recognize today. So people we didn't really know so well at the time, but I think on that minivan, Alan Hale was driving, one of the OP managers for Flesh and Blood. Ian Kinderdine was there. And then we had, I think Kale McCreath was on that bus, Matt Rogers, a few other players whose names pop up quite a lot these days. And from then on, it was just history. So we played at a bunch of the Road to 10Ks, like you mentioned. I think back then, it was back in the good old days when New Zealand was the pinnacle of Flesh and Blood. So we were what everyone looked to. We played a bunch of those tournaments going forward. Then we went and played the Calling. I was fortunate enough to come in at second place, playing. So I lost to Control Katsu in the final. And then from there, I think Carol and I started up the Session Blood podcast. We just kind of had a bit of a look around and saw that there was some people doing a little bit of content. I think DM Armada and Red Sword Rogue were around back in those days. I think, and I'm sorry because I can't fully remember the names, but I think there were like some OG creators who are still around today, like some of the American channels who had started doing a little bit of content. But one thing we thought might be cool to do is a very just like strictly competitive focused Flesh and Blood podcast. just because we saw like there were definitely questions coming up on Facebook and stuff quite a lot, people asking sort of similar questions here and there, and we thought, well, you know what, maybe we'll just see if we can try help share a little bit of things we've picked up here and there and spread it out to the community and see if anyone cares. The very first podcast, Carol just came around to my apartment. We didn't have any recording gear, so I just like, oh, my phone has like a voice memo function, so maybe we'll just do that. So I literally put my phone down on the table, and we had like our script, if you will, was just like 4 bullet points, and we're just like, well, you know, we've known each other for so long.
Yeah, you just write down some stuff. Yeah.
We'll just sort of go ahead and riff, and then that was the first Flesh and Blood podcast, and then we just kind of went from there. Then at a certain point, we got invited to go record a few games at the LSS studio, just to put up on the YouTube channel. So we're playing a few Blitz games here and there. And then after that, James actually asked Carol and myself, would we be interested in doing a temporary dev contract? And I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, I guess that temporary dev contract it wasn't temporary.
Yeah, so I actually worked in, so after we did dev for about 3 months or so. Carol stayed on as dev. I actually was asked if I'd be interested in doing Premier OP. So I was running our Premier Organized Play program for about a year. The second set of national championships, where we had about, I forget exactly, 25 to 30 nationals. That was kind of my trial by fire, trying to get all these organized, working with a lot of organizers around the world, all the amazing local game stores. I worked with Josh Scott on like the very early version of the judge program, which, you know, is in a much better spot than when I left it. Originally, we were having to use like spreadsheets and stuff to run out the judge program. It was kind of the Wild West back then, but had a lot of fun doing that. Eventually, I kind of left Premier OP. I was kind of thinking of going into working in the legal field because I sort of have a law degree that I don't really use. And then, yeah, eventually I kind of just found I went and played at the Pro Tour in New Jersey. Almost like rekindled. I never lost my love of Fab. It really reminded me what I loved so much about Fab. So I came back, spoke to James, asked if I could come back to dev, and then been a dev ever since.
No, that's fantastic. And I mean, obviously, I've been personally really enjoying how the game's been going, especially lately. So, I mean, I'd say you guys are doing a good job. It was a good idea to bring you on. I guess just a couple quick things I want to ask kind of about that earlier meta. So you mentioned like Control Katsu, and I looked at that list where it was like Kadachi's, Drone to Brutality, every D-React, I think except for, I think Blue Sinks were the only D-React in the game. Blue Sinks and yeah, I think quite literally we're the only because this was Sasha Markovi, I think is his last name.
Yep.
It was his list and ended up sweeping all the dories. Like nobody knew what the heck it was. Did that deck just like were you guys aware that was a deck, or was it literally like that day you found out Control Katsu was a thing and it was like, okay, now we got to figure out on the fly how to beat this?
Yeah, just caught me completely off guard. Came out of left field. I think people weren't really aware of that deck in terms of like, you know, the players so much. So it was a great example of sort of a rogue deck, if you will, being very well, nicely calibrated for the field. One thing about the meta back then is Rhinar wasn't really explored too much. I think Rhinar was probably the natural predator of that deck because really being able to disrupt them with Intimidate and cards like that and leaving them with a lot of dead cards in hand. But because Rhinar was just like such a small sliver of the metagame, it was really the triangle of Dorinthia, Bravo, and Katsu. So I tested a lot into the Mirror, into Dorinthia, into Bravo. I was quite confident about my game plan into those. Unfortunately, it's a funny story because the semi-final, I won my semi-final, and then there was the matchup between I think it was Nick Butcher versus Sasha in the other semi-final, which went on for a very long time. But I kind of decided, you know, to chat with my friends. We went off, got some water, got some food. So I didn't really sit down and watch that game. So even going into the final, I wasn't fully aware that it was just pure control Katsu. I was thinking like, wait, is this still like a little bit combo, but a little bit control? So I had to try like figure out on the fly how to combat this deck. I think it was really interesting matchup. I kind of figured out a little bit too late what I was meant to be doing. By that point, it was too late. So I think that deck is very good at fatigue because it obviously has access to Drone of Brutality. It's running Tome of Farndale just for a little bit of life gain. This is Solace for the life game. Just chip away at Kadachi's, just go like 1-1-5 or 1-1-6 over and over and over and over again. like I said, I realized a little bit too late that the key to that matchup on my side was preserving the Snapdragon Scalers. The Snappies was the critical piece for me to try and win that game because I think as an aggro castle, you're able to pressure that deck quite well, but you are going to get fatigued unless you are very aware of what you're doing.
Mhm.
So I think I realized, unfortunately, after I'd used my Snappies about 2 turns later, I realized like the path to winning that game was a little bit roundabout, but it involved keeping the Snapdragon Scalers to use on a McGinty's release because what you want to be doing in that ultra late game in that game is setting it up so you have McGinty's release in Arsenal with your Snapdragons available, and you have Lord of Wind plus 3 blues in hand, and then you want to go Tunic, McGinty's release, crack your Snapdragon Scalers, and then just play the Lord of Wind natural combo off the McGinty's, pitch like 9 resources into it, and basically remembrance 9 cards back into your deck, and that's how you win the fatigue game plan.
Okay.
Um, but unfortunately for me, I realized that like 2 turns after I binned off my Snappies for a random like blackout kick, and that was that.
It's
big
interesting.
credit, big credit to Sasha though. It was a really cool deck.
Well, and I have to say, I think this is where, because even just listening to that, I can already start to tell the difference between somebody who's a skilled enough player and deep enough knowledge of the game to even figure that out. Because I don't think I ever would have figured out, like, Snappy's the Mugenshi release to do the Lord of Wind to put cards back in the deck. Like, that's just not a lot. I mean, I'm not a Katsu player to begin with, but that is, like, the level of, I guess, like understanding of a game and its core fundamentals and knowing the opponent's deck and exactly what you can do, because that just seems like the kind of play that most average player wouldn't even see. Like using your cards in that way specifically to just put like 9 cards back is something that I think just it doesn't come to everybody, and I think that's really what makes like the best players apart from like the good players, because I would say I'm a good player but I'm not at like the level, and it makes sense as to why you guys ended up being developers. If you're able to see lines like this, then I imagine it helps a lot when you're developing cards or testing, things that have been designed. You can kind of find where things are broken. Um, so that's very
Yeah, it
interesting.
was. Yeah, it was a cool fight. Like I really enjoyed playing the Welcome to Earth only CC
I
way back in the day. It was cool.
I was gonna say, how was it with 60 like kajillion D reacts running around? Because it's so I swear every deck is running like at least 12 to 15 D reacts.
Yeah, so again, I think it was because the nature of that meta. That's why Brute would have been, or Rhino would have been so well placed, but it was just not. I think a lot of it was just like, oh, it's this class where, it's kind of relevant now with all the Scabskins discourse. It's like, oh, you just have to randomly roll your Scabskins, otherwise your deck doesn't do anything, which is absolutely not true. But I think because the other decks, the game plan was so clear and relatively straightforward. I'm Katsu, I want to combo and do this. I'm Dorinthia, I want to stack counters with my Dawnblade. I'm Bravo, I want to dominate my big attacks and have all this disruption. Whereas Brute, it wasn't so obvious. It's like, well, I have Blood Rush Bellow, but how do I get the action points? I just don't want to be going 2-6 over and over again. So I think the defense reacts were why they were so prevalent is because you needed to be the defense reacts were very good against both Bravo and Dorinthia. Cards like Unmovable, for example. I think in my list I had 2 or 3 red Unmovable. Um, and into the mirror of decks like Katsu, you really wanted access to cards like Flick Flack, for example, and Sink Below, because those were very good that when you're both just playing back and forth game plan, if you were able to play a more mid-rangey plan, be like, I can sit back and defend you out until my big combo turn comes online. That might be how I can win this game. So I kind of figured out early on my plan to Katsu was just board in all the red D reacts. And I always want to go second in the mirror when we were playing back then, and just kind of play on and off. So I can chill, I can defend out your attacks, but also I can come for my big combo turn when it comes online. But you're absolutely right. I think you would have seen a lot of cards like Steelblade Shunt and a lot of the Dorinthia lists. I think another thing to keep in mind is back then the equipment was a lot more limited. It's not like a lot
Iron
more
Rod.
decks have access. Yep, I mean that's the big thing, right? There was no Arcanite Skullcap, so people were running like Iron Rod. Some people were running Hope Merchant's Hood and Dorinthia. Some people ran Iron Rod Head. Um, there was no Fate Foreseen back then as well, so I think people just wanted to play all the best defensive cards that they had access to.
Yeah, I was gonna say too. One card obviously that came with the constructed decks, not the actual like Welcome to Wraith, set. Was what is it? What I wasn't. It was just
Somersault.
somersault. Yeah. So
Yep. Yep.
like now that card suddenly got after Crew came out, not after Crew. It felt like after Monarch. Crew it started to drop off a bit, and then come Monarch like it did. I feel like Fate Foreseen probably was kind of what did it for Somersault for the most part, because it's like now we have a zero
Yep.
for 4 that is just a 0 for 4 from the hand rather than from the arsenal. But interestingly enough, was it a bit of a flash what is it, a blast from the past when some Kasai players started to run Springboard Somersault just as like a yellow D react that they could, use later, banish from their graveyard?
Yeah, absolutely. It was really funny because back in those very early testing days, I think we saw cards like Lunging Press was the other one, and Springfield Somersault. They were in the IRA decks, but not in the constructed decks. And then it was kind of this thing where, wait, are we allowed to play these? And then check in, and it's like, yeah, you can play them. And I was always a big fan of the one-off Lunging Press and the Bravo decks as well. When they just overblock and you come in with that. Springboard Somersault back then was, I think I ran 3 of those as well because you just wanted as many 0/4s as possible. Also, with it being a yellow card, it was perfect in Katsu yellow 0 cost. You could pitch 2 Kadachis. No, I haven't actually seen it pop up that much in the Kasai list, but that makes me happy. It is a blast from the past. I mean, in Kasai, right, it's a yellow, so you can banish it to your hero ability, and it can also be another 0/4. That's really cool. It brings a smile to my face hearing it still sings and play.
Yeah, I think there was a list for, I can't remember what event it was. It was like a calling or something. I can't remember if it won or if it was like second place or like top 8 or something, but it was like a Kasai that broke out and the guy was running, it was very defensive list, a lot of D reacts, like very slow deck. And Springboard Somersault was in it. And I even thought, I was like, man, because I remember when I got into the game just after, like between Crew and Monarch first, Springboard Somersault was still a card that people were like, yep, you want this for your decks. Like certain decks want to use it. Like, it's a really good card. And then basically after Monarch, nobody ever talked about the card again, but it was kind of cool. I got to pull it out and try that deck, and it was really fun to be able to use it because I didn't get to use it very much. I remember even when Crew had come out, like with Crew first, when I got into the game was after everything had jumped up in price. So like everything from Crucible, even a blue hit and run, I remember was like $15 just for the common because like there was just, it was so hard to get, right? So Springboards I think were like $20, and I'm like, I'm just playing with my friends right now at the kitchen table. I'm not buying those cards. I'll buy a couple like Majestics in that, and then when I got into Blitz, I ended up buying like what was it, Courage of Bladehold and Spoils of War for Dorinthia, which at the time were very expensive. That was like $400 just for 2 Spoils of War and a Courage, because it was
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
incredibly expensive. So it's very nice to see at least that the prices were very high during Crew, and now they've come down. And we're totally not restarting this after my OBS has decided to stop recording. So if that sentence didn't perfectly follow the previous, that's why. It's cut out on me a couple times. We're trying our best over here. I don't know what's wrong with my PC today, but I seem to have nothing but technical issues. I guess we'll go into where I was. We had actually talked a little bit past where it had cut off, and I had been asking you about card combinations. I almost lost it there, but card combinations. So obviously, I think an infamous one is the Scalita and Sonata, where
Yep.
players didn't really pick it up during Monarch. It just kind of flew by the wayside. And the next thing you know, I think it was closer to Tails. It was like late Monarch meta, early Tails meta, where all of a sudden, I believe Hayden Dale had one. I think it was Nationals. Australian Nationals, I believe, with like this Viserai deck, and it exploded. Is there any kind of like, I know you've already answered this for me, but I'm gonna ask it anyways. Is there any like combination that players have missed or anything that you know of, even if it's just like a yes or a no?
Yeah. So yeah, it's one of those ones where if there was ones, I probably wouldn't be able to say. I get a little bit of trouble. But just speaking generally to that, I think these days, as the general skill level and player base increases, like the average skill level now is just so much higher than it was like way back in the day when there was a smaller player base. I think a lot of that's from just more players, more content creators sharing the knowledge with the community. Hayden Dale, for example, shout out to Arsenal Pass. They do a lot of great work. I think these days the community is a lot quicker at figuring out certain card combinations when something works really well with another card, for example, and at just refining and tuning the Ickless very, very quickly. The amount of hours that the community puts into working on decks within a new set, within the first week, it's probably just going to surpass, maybe even shorter, all the total number of hours and games that we've put in throughout the entire dev cycle for that set. And that's not because we're lazy and we don't play games and we don't do work. It's just a function of numbers, right? There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of players out there. If everyone plays a couple hours, that's 400,000 hours of game time. So there's probably things here and there that maybe get missed initially, or maybe it just takes a little bit of time for people to pick up on. But like I say, I think the community does a very good job at figuring out the card combinations and deck lists and stuff these days.
I mean, yeah, that's actually something I've heard. I believe that was like stated even back in Magic's old days, where it was like some people would complain about card design and people had to point out, like, the player base is going to figure things out. And I think that's something where, a new Magic set comes out and within like a day or two, the meta is completely figured out. Like the decks are figured out because you just have millions of people playing this game and just figuring everything out right away. At least Flesh and Blood is. I think it's both that it's new enough and there's not like so many players. Like the game's obviously grown since the early days, but there's not so many players that it's not all figured out. But I also will give credit to this game where I think for the most part, I think Flesh and Blood's a deeper game than Magic, just because like in terms of trying to understand stuff. Because one of my things with this game has always been in Magic, you put something on the board, you put another thing on the board, or you counter spells or whatever. They're pretty streamlined, where it's kind of like you can kind of see what they do together, like just in your hand, putting them on the board. It's a little more straightforward. Whereas in Flesh and Blood, every turn cycle there's a whole fresh new hand. It's every hand is a puzzle. You've got to think about what's left in your deck. There's all the pitch stacking, so you got to figure out what's coming next. And it's a little more nebulous because it's not like every turn you keep your hand and you just add to it every single time and you deal with your board presence. It's like every single time it's something new. And so trying to figure out like how your cards work with each other, you can play like 5 games and just never draw the 2 cards you want to test together in the same hand or get them set up, and you have to like keep trying to see if they work together. So I find that it's a bit more difficult. But do you think that
Yeah,
Flesh and Blood will get to that point where players like very quickly figure out decks in the meta, or do you hope it never hits that point?
yeah, that's an interesting question. I think inevitably, as the average skill level, increases and increases, and we get more and more players, it probably is inevitable that things will start to get figured out a little bit quicker. But I'm just thinking back on my answer to your question, and I think one really cool thing is I want to give a lot of credit to players is some of the innovation that comes out, particularly for some of these big events or decks that people manage to keep a little bit under wraps. So you mentioned previously the Bullander Michael Hamilton list, for example. I think that was a very, Iceland had been up for a long time. And then there's this kind of novel approach to the deck list where it's very much kind of a numbers value game plan with the Scar for Scars, the Woundables, that kind of thing. I think I've mentioned previously on sort of other podcasts stuff as well. I think there's a really rich history in Fab of these cool decks just that people may have heard of or maybe hadn't heard of, all fly under the radar, that just come out of seemingly nowhere and just crush events. I mean, going back to the very first calling with that Control Ninja deck, I think of Bullander. I think of things like Matthew Falk's Belittle Briar, that playing cards like Yellow Snatch. You're kind of looking at your screen like, wait, am I seeing that pitch correctly? Just kind of figuring out how to extract value from these things. Charles Dunn Big Briar, for example. A lot of, I think even looking at things like Hatchet Dorinthia, for example, it's not like that deck was completely unknown and that no one had heard of it, but I'm pretty confident that if you ask people before the Pro Tour, hey, do you reckon we'll see a couple of Hatchet Dorinthias in the top 8? Like, there's no way the community is picking that. I actually did like a Twitter giveaway where I said, can predict the top 8 winning hero, and there weren't that many Dorinthia picks coming along in there for sure. So I think that aspect of it is very, very cool, that while things may be sort of quote unquote somewhat figured out earlier and earlier as the game matures and grows and grows and grows, I think there still is a lot of room for innovation and people coming up with quite cool decks or little sort of twists on certain other decks, or even just finding really cool tech cards that allow them to gain that edge over the metagame.
Yeah, there's I think a huge advantage in playing a deck that is kind of cemented and figured out, because you get to learn the knowledge off of everybody else's playtesting. You can share information with other players, and there's just like that the knowledge that, like, okay, this is figured out. We know that this works. But the benefit into being, if you're, because, like, again, I think there's a huge difference between being a good player, like, even a really good player, and being the best. Like, there's that, like, you can get 90% of the way there, and but getting that extra 10% is like a huge like difference. And this is where you'll see players, like you said, like Matthew Folks, who will show up with his Bullet Briar and just sweep everybody else, because not only are you playing a deck that is powerful, obviously they wouldn't be playing the decks otherwise, but it's a deck that nobody else is prepared for, nobody else's sideboard is prepared for. They don't know the deck strategy, like that Control Katsu that showed up in the very first calling, where you guys, clearly nobody had it. I mean, I can't remember. There was the one quarterfinal and one semifinal match recorded. For some reason, not the finals, but there was two on the YouTube channel. And in the one game, I can't remember who it was, and I apologize. It's in my notes and it's in my script. But the one Dory player went up against him, and he sideboarded out his Iron Song Determinations to face Katsu, and it was like that's the card that he needed to actually have any chance of beating Fatigue Katsu, was the one that gave Dominate, so you could actually get through in any of your damage, and he had sided them out. So it's like, when you show up with a deck that nobody knows what it's doing, you can just get people in a big tournament, because everybody's like, especially, and I've noticed, and this isn't like pick on pro players, but because, like, what else do you have to go off of? But I've noticed that a lot of, like, more professional players, they really like when a meta is just like, here's the defined decks, here's what you have to worry about. You can figure out that meta, get as good into it as you can be. And then again, though, is then some dark horse shows up, and you just don't know what to do. Your whole plan is blown wide open, and you're trying to figure out the deck on the how to face it on the fly.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think even if I'm correct, the semi-final of that calling, I think that might have been my game that was recorded when I was playing my kind of mid-range Katsu into a Dorinthia deck. So I just, like I said, I was really stacked up on defense reaction.
Yeah.
So I brought in all the flick flacks, the springboards, the things like that. And it was funny. I like to joke with my friends and stuff on the dev team a little bit that the play I jokingly refer to as the block, and that one where I was ahead on life, and it was somewhat of a slightly unusual thing to do at the time. It's not like it's the craziest play ever, but I think I was ahead like 10 to 12 life, and there was a big Steel Blade Supremacy turn. And I kind of just looked at the board and was like, well, if I push the Mask of Momentum in here, which, like, I'm still at like 25 life or so, but if I do this, then I'm pretty sure I don't need that draw trigger for the rest of the game. This is the big turn. So if I block this out, I can just tempo out from here. And yeah, and then that was kind of, I blocked out the big turn. The Supremacy didn't trigger and was able to run away with it from there. But there's also just like really small, cool sideboarding things you can figure out when you test and trying to figure out the keys to certain matchups. I think to the Crucible meta as well. Back then, that was when mid-range dash was like the undisputed king of the meta. It was just like basically very, very good into everything. I sat down and tested with my friend Rohan, who's also a dev these days. And what we tested, I really wanted to play Katsu for a long time, but I just could not crack that matchup. And, my friend Carol, his daughter was, her due date was right around the time of Nationals. So he'd been working on a Rhino list, but he wasn't able to go down. And then I said, you know what, chuck me that Rhino list, because a card that just came out was Arc Smash. And I just want to be Arc Smashing Chambers all day. So So he gave me kind of like a 2-day crash course on how to play the deck. So I started testing a bit of, like, I think I played like 3 games into Katsu and 2 games into Dorinthia before the tournament, and then just sat down and played my friend Rohan playing into the dash matchup. And one small thing we figured out with that is that when you're playing that matchup, you really want to run, we felt, 1 copy of Remembrance in either Reinhardt or Dash, but probably both. Because we found when we sat down and played that matchup a lot, the play pattern was that I could just play somewhat defensive, wait till I can Arc Smash all your chambers, and once I do that, you probably can't beat me. Like my deck, I think I played, I know we were talking about fatigue just off camera briefly, but that one I play like 68, 70 cards, and I was just thinking, look, I can just sit here and block all day until I smash the 3 chambers, and then you have no win con. And then he started putting one Remembrance in, so I'd smash all the 3 chambers, he'd Remembrance back the 3 chambers, and then play them all out and kill me in the end game. And so then I had to put 1 Remembrance into my deck. So I had smashed all his chambers, he Remembrance back the chambers, and I Remembrance back my Arc Smashes, and then we play from there. And it was actually really cool that year at Nationals because we both ended up making top 8. Unfortunately, we had to play each other in the top 8, but our game played out exactly like we'd played in testing. So I went through, managed to eventually smash all his chambers. He remembered some all back. I remembered all my arc smashes. But it was really funny. It got to this really tense moment where like he just natural drew his chambers almost immediately and starting to drop them down one by one. And I've got like less than 20 cards left in deck. And I'm like, this is fine, because once I draw my Arc Smash, I'm going to win the game. I draw up my hand, don't draw Arc Smash. Draw up my hand, don't draw Arc Smash. It got to the point where I'm like, I've got one hand sign cycle left to draw these, or I'm going to lose. But then fortunately, the Fab God smiled down upon me, and I managed to get there in a close game.
No, that actually sounds really incredible. Because something too is like, I mean, again, most people wouldn't even know what that meta was like because most people weren't playing back then. Like, I'd imagine probably about 70 to 80% of the people playing nowadays, maybe even more. Because I mean, you guys probably have a better idea of this, but like, I imagine the game has grown exponentially since those very early days. I mean, like,
Massively,
you know,
massively.
obviously there was that big wave pre-Monarch, and then it kind of came down a bit. But after that, like, the community has still continued to grow. And now instead of being people interested just in the money, it's now actual players, which is a very good thing. Because it's just like thinking about using, because I mean, most people look at Arc Smash and they go like, this card is trash, it's complete garbage. I mean, what was it, Smashing Performance, when that came out, everybody was like, even though, you know, Evo came out after and it was playable, everybody just kind of, quite frankly, shit on the card. They're like, this is useless, why do we need this, is so garbage. And it's like, but I think people don't realize that, like, Mech is one of those classes that when it's positioned well, oh my god, is it ever, it can be really oppressive. Like that control kind of mid-range dash, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't it kind of like a, almost still like a hybrid list where it could drop a few of the D reacts, play a bit more offensive on certain matchups, but then others it would play a lot more control. And I mean, I imagine that pistol control beat Katsu any day of the week, because it really seemed like in that meta, Katsu kind of dropped off for a little bit when Dash came onto the scene, or is that incorrect?
That's how I felt personally. Like I said, I tried to play it for a long time. It's funny you mentioned Smashing Performance. Yeah, like that card got a lot of flack when it came out. One of my friends mentioned the other day, sent me a link. Apparently it's like 15, $20 now. It's actually popping up in a lot. It popped up in a number of KO lists as like a 1 or 2 of sideboard card, potentially to deal with stuff like Chamber. But yeah, back then, control, you're absolutely right. So some of the earliest lists were pure dash control, where it just ran like chambers, sigils, all the life gain, and well, like chambers, sigils, all the defense reacts. Sorry, and it would just sit there and grind you out with inevitability over time. You spark of genius to get your chambers down. Once you had 3, you were just, and damage was just incredibly efficient. I think when it was Arcane Rising meta before Crucible, that to my mind was like not so great of a meta because there was just no real answer for dash at all, because you had the combination of Arcanite Skullcap coming out and Fate Foreseen coming out. So not only did you get a massive upgrade in the head slot, you also got another 0-4 defense reaction. So you could play Fate, Sync, and Springboard if you wanted into that in that deck, and the output just didn't match the defensive output. Mm-hmm. So when Arc Smash came out, to me that was like, you know, a godsend. Like finally there's a way to deal with chambers. Funnily enough, Plasma Purifier came out in the same set, and people were like, come on, man, we're already struggling with dash control, and now you give them Purifier. But you're right, the list adapted over time to become more of a mid-range list with access to both game plans. So I think people like Matt Rogers, Jacob Pearson, I think like Nick Butcher early on, kind of cotton onto this list where you got to take advantage of the high octane Tome of Fire combo. So you high octane, you boost to get your multiple action points, and then you tome from Arsenal, gain a bunch of life, keep your turn going, boost, and then end the turn by shooting you like 6 or 7 times with the pistol. That was probably, there were still people playing pure dash control even to this day, but back then I think the numbers will support this. The mid-range list was the better deck, just straight up. It would win in the mirror, and it would still have the same good matchups into all the other decks. So I think that made it quite tricky for a deck like Katsu. There's still a lot of Katsu around, but I think it made it quite tricky for that deck to compete, because not only did you have to have enough defensive cards to be able to deal with decks like Bravo and Dorinthia, you also had to have enough of an aggressive game plan to deal with Dash, and threading that needle was just very, very hard. You know, the more you tilted towards the Dash matchup, you could get it to a point where you felt okay playing it, but then you just didn't have the tools to deal with the Dorinthia or Bravo. I felt Rhino was a very cool option in that meta because I think your Bravo matchup, the way I built it, was horrible. But Bravo massively struggled with the dash decks. Like most of the time, there are a few people who could win it here and there, but most of the time it was like very, very tough matchup for them. Too much defense, no way to deal with the chambers. But Rhinar was a deck that you were fine. You were definitely fine into Katsu. Dorinthia was kind of tough, but you could win that matchup. And Dash, sometimes you would lose, but you felt pretty good playing it.
Okay, yeah, that's very yeah. Because I remember when I was doing some research, it felt like at the time the top two decks were kind of Dorinthia and Dash, but like Dash was
I think that's fair.
if Dorinthia was like let's say an 8 out of 10 in the meta, Dash was the 11 out of 10. Like it was like you got Dash up here, then Dory, and then everybody else kind of underneath. And I know yeah, because Dory was like kind of the hybrid list as well, where it felt like yeah, the two best decks kind of felt like they were hybrid lists. Where I mean, Dory just didn't have as much stuff to use for her weapons because like so she was running a lot of attack actions as well to kind of be able to extend your chain out a little bit more. Or if you give like go again with like a hit and run on the Dawn Blade and they block it out, you're like okay, well now I can throw like an E strike at the end of the chain to at least get in some damage. And then Dash obviously being able to kind of lean a bit into two different strategies on the mid range build just seemed really good. Now it's
You
interesting.
actually wrote. I was just gonna say, I'll see if I can dig it up because I wrote an article way back in the day, going through the Crucible meta, and it was one of these things where I just it was kind of like a passion project. I just wrote it. I think it got published on. I forget
The Wraith
the
Times.
exact name of the words. The Red Times. The Red. No, it was Logan Bollum's website from way back
I have
in
no
the day.
idea.
I've Sorry, Logan, I forget the name. But basically, I wrote this like it's like 5 or 6 thousand words, just a full rundown of the Crucible meta. So going through like the road to national season, like the national championships, all that sort of thing. I can chuck it to you at some point if you're interested. I think I've got it on my Google Drive
Honestly,
somewhere.
yes, please. Actually, I'm not gonna lie. So as I'm talking about this, there's a little thought in the back of my mind of like a video project of like the history of Flesh and Blood's metagame, and like I could maybe crunch like Welcome to Wraith Arcane Rising and Crew into a video, and then do like the next three in a video, and kind of like do a series or something and go in depth. But like one of the things when I was looking into these old metas is I kind of realized like I'm researching it and I can gain a lot of information by research, but it's not the same as being there during that meta, and like
Yep.
actually experiencing it. So it's like if I was to ever do videos like that, I definitely would have to like talk to certain like you and other people who are around at the time to kind of get get a better idea of what I'm talking about because nothing's worse than making a video and getting half your stuff wrong and then realizing okay, I'm an idiot. So, you know.
Yeah, the Dorinthia decks, you're right? They were kind of forced into playing this game plan where they'd run things like Flock in order to extend their chain a little bit wider. They'd run E strikes, Command and Conquer. The only way I feel that they could try force through these dash decks is to try sidestep a little bit. So you attack with the Dawnblade, try and get them to commit some overblocks, maybe play Glint the Quicksilver, or you're coming with the Quicken, and then they go like hit and run CNC for 9 or something, and just like slowly chip away damage, get tempo, try and get the dash to not have an arsenal card, and then like that's when you push. Similar for Katsu as well. You had to like I always talked about it. You play phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Like phase 1 is just the early game where you get the big blocks off the equipment, like the Teklo Foundry Heart. Phase 2 is where you get the little blocks off the equipment, so they can't block your Kadachi to turn off the mask or whatever. And then phase 3 is you finally press them to the point where their equipment's like mainly down, they have no arsenal, and that is your very small window to try and close the game.
Hmm. Well, that's another thing about the early meta that I noticed, and even playing it myself because I did start with like bought a couple like pre-made blitz decks that like Red Riot Games had put together, and I bought a couple of those here in Canada. I bought like a box of Welcome to Wraith, and then after that, I ended up buying like a lot of boxes after that first one because I was like, okay,
Yep.
I'm into this. This is amazing. But yeah, back in that meta, like when you played with your friends, especially then, was like every game came down to like the wire where it was you were both at one life. You're trying to leverage that just at the last point of damage, and you'll spend like sometimes you would spend 5 or 6 turns like just attacking and blocking, neither player taking damage, and then until you get that one way to get it. And I imagine in competitive play, like you said, like even explaining how you would beat control Katsu by doing this very specific line to return like up to 9 cards into your deck. It's kind of crazy like the amount of steps you had to go through back then. And I mean, I imagine still today there is a lot of games like that. I mean, I think a good example is Pro Tour Arthur Trehay, like having the Sigil of B is like one way out of that game. So
Yep.
you still have that, but it I guess it shows not only how deep Flesh and Blood is, but kind of how more things change, the more things stay the same. Where like it's very much this game of insane depth to the point where I don't know, sometimes I even struggle to like, I don't think I'm a bad player, but I there are some ways that I just can't wrap my head around, like, very extensive plays like that, where you've got, like, the one specific path to victory. It kinda reminds me of when I was playing Dromai against Oldhim, and just I hated that matchup so much because it was like,
Yeah.
you got to touch and get a time snap or the Mage Masters to get the go again, and, and it's just I hated that, but, sometimes that's why
It's tricky.
at least it's like my game plan's the same. It's just axe, 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 axe. Just that the whole game. No extra thoughts.
Yeah, it's quite cool. I'm glad you brought up the Pro Tour because man, those were some like awesome top eight games. I really enjoyed watching them. Like another of them, as you said, like really came down to the wire as well. Very, very close games. And I think it was a cool showcase as well as like I think sometimes people try and boil fair down to the numbers a little bit too much. And I think they were talking about this on the Runways podcast a little bit the other day as well. Talking about sometimes it's a little bit easy to look at some of these matchups and go, okay, it's all just numbers, numbers, numbers. I present X 7.4 damage each turn, and you present like 6.8, and that little 0.6 over 40 turns is going to amount to me winning the game. But I think the top eight really showcased as well, and between the Dorinthias and the Kasais and even the KOs, of the benefits of people sort of trying to play the player a little bit, bluffing at the right time, holding cards back, trying when to notice, like maybe not always taking the mathematically strict percentage optimal line in the sense that like, oh, if I do this, I am 48% chance to win versus if I take this other line, I'm 44% chance to win. But maybe the 44% chance is actually you're better overall in the scheme of the game because you're able to try and entice your opponent into making a mistake with their blocking or whatever, or maybe you're able to bluff by doing this and you get a small advantage that way. So I think that is something that some of the great players are able to do very well, and that maybe separates them and allows them to consistently do really well at these big events.
I think you make a really, really good point about bluffing, because I think a thing that, yeah, everybody gets so stuck in on the math, but I think what really separates the best players from everyone else is the psychology as well, because I think people forget that you're not just playing against an AI, you're playing against another human being. And a lot of the times, like even the best players, sometimes there'll be that little tick on their face, or they'll just like that little sigh that they'll give when they draw their hand, and it's like then you kind of know like, oh, okay, maybe they don't have like a really good hand. This is my turn to push in. Like you can read stuff from your opponent. It's also very valuable. Like, I mean, I think the most readable play. They've got a Command and Conquer coming in. They're playing Bravo, and they've got a Tunic trigger up. They got one floating, and they have a card in hand or arsenal. It's like pretty sure that's a pummel, but they could also be bluffing it. And I think that aspect, like in that situation, there is math of like the value of the pummel versus cards in hand, but you also have to, be like, are they bluffing? Are they actually being legitimate? Is there actually one there? Or are they, just going to arsenal that last card and they're just trying to make me think that there's a pummel coming? And I really do think that people kind of forget about that a lot, but I also think it's partially because it's easy to talk about the math side of things, but it's like not virtually impossible, but it's very difficult to talk about the psychology aspect because it changes from person to person. Not everybody's able to read other people as well as others, and it's just not as simple of a topic to kind of boil down. Like just doing the basic math is like you just look at the cards, look at the numbers, add them together versus the other numbers on the opponent side. It's very easy to kind of do that. So, but I agree. I think there is too much focus on the numbers.
Yeah, I think a great example, like you mentioned, is stuff like if you're playing tectonic plating. I know a lot of guiding lists run stuff like Tunic these days, but let's say you have a red card, a blue, and a Command and Conquer in hand, and you have like a Spinal Crush or Crippling Crush in arsenal. Perhaps your strictly mathematically correct line there is you pitch the red to make a Seismic Surge, you pitch the blue and Command and Conquer. You have one resource floating. You've maximized your value because you have the Seismic Surge for next turn, but now you're face up. It's like I have one resource floating, the Command and Conquer's coming in, there's no pummel. So I think there's spots sometimes where maybe you're just meant to pitch the red and the blue, overpitch by 2, Command and Conquer, leave 2 floating. The super obvious pummel play, right? He's definitely got they've definitely got the pummel because there's 2 resources up and they're not just going to not make the surge there. And I think that's the sort of thing sometimes where you can gain small edges by trying to bluff your opponent or put them in this thing where they really have to assess the risk reward. You know, you put them in the blender, make them make a really difficult decision one way or the other.
Yeah, I think attack reactions are the best examples of those. Like even when you're facing Dory, like in the finals match with Arthur Chahey and Maximilian Klein, when Arthur drew the sigil and he plays it, he doesn't actually know that he's won the game because Max had drawn a card
Yep.
off the glint and he could have drawn this in the swing, right? If he drew it in the swing, he wins the game right then and there, like on the spot. So there is very much of like trying to force your opponents to do things. Like even when I'm playing, sometimes I know that my attack, like I'm not going to do a whole lot with it and I don't have the attack reaction, but if I can get them to block with 2 cards, that's what I need right now. It's not even that I need to push damage, it's just I need cards out of their hand, so hopefully on the then they can only send a little bit at me. I can hopefully maybe block with only 1 card and keep 3, so then I can have my big turn. And I feel like that's kind of the bluffing is really where it comes in, and it's less about math and more about just trying to outmaneuver the opponent on a more personal level, which I think bluffing is. And I think that's, it's very much an underrated part of the game that I think is way more important than people realize.
Yeah, that's why I really like playing Katsu back in the day for stuff like that, because you'd have some, sometimes some wild plays where I have a 4-card hand that just doesn't really function. And there might be a way for me to chip a little bit more damage doing one play, but maybe I just want to go like pitch a blue, Kadachi, and then snatch with like 2 cards in hand and a card in arsenal. And it's like, well, you've got to have the razor reflex. Like, you've just got to have the razor reflex there. Otherwise, the play doesn't make sense. But also, you can maybe sidestep with the Snapdragon Scalers. But the thing is, sometimes maybe you actually had nothing, but you've got that Surging Strike in arsenal, and you're keeping a Whelm and Gustwave in hand to set up the combo for next turn. And you're like, by taking, or maybe that's not the best example because you're probably just surging through there. But basically, like, you've got a couple of cards that you want to preserve, and you're like, well, if I can get them to give me 3 cards here by doing this thing, and maybe I lose 1 or 2 damage on this hand cycle, but if I can get them to give me 3 cards and then I preserve my power cards for 1 more turn and then I get the full combo, then I've achieved tempo. Like, I've got the tempo now in this game. Whereas if I take the mathematically fully optimal damage line, I might eke out 2 or 3 more points of damage, but that doesn't get me there in the long run. And not a perfect example, but I think some of the best players kind of understand that there are certain lines where you have to bluff. You have to try and put your opponent in the blender. You have to make them make the right decision, and sometimes it'll get you there because of it.
Yeah, forcing your opponents to make decisions on its own, because like being human, sometimes we make the wrong decisions, or we guess something, we get it a little wrong, even if you're not intentionally bluffing. I think the perfect card for that is Snatch is a really good example, where it's like you throw a Snatch on the board, even if it's the last thing on your chain, you can't do anything else. They now have to make the decision: do I block this? Or do I let it hit, let them get an extra card, let them get an arsenal? That arsenal could be, I mean, in some decks, like, it could just be something where you're like, okay, I don't really care that you got a card to arsenal, because it could be something you don't even want to arsenal, or like it's not the best option. Maybe you draw blue and it's like, well, you don't want to arsenal your blue. But it presents decisions, and then they might make the wrong decision, or one that they think is right, but ends up being, maybe they block with 2 cards to block it out. It's like, good for you, because, I mean, you just rip 2 cards out of their hand. And then because of that, even though they might have technically got more value because they use 6 to block essentially 7, because Snatch in another card is, technically 7 value. And they're like, well, I only use 6. I won out by 1. But then if their 2-card hand just can't put enough pressure on you, and you're able to keep extra cards, and then, like, even though, like you said, it's not mathematically correct to do the one play, but I feel like I'm kind of losing it here anyways. But I think you kind of know what I mean, where like, sometimes those decisions make a play later on. I like, when I'm playing the game, I don't know about you, but I don't think just about damage, like I do, but my goal is like, I want to get my opponent in a spot where they're lower than I am, hopefully, and they're going to be forced to overblock with cards in their hand. So then I'm able to be in that position of like, sometimes being like, sure, I'll underblock so I can use some life total at the end game, and then just use my bigger hands to keep putting pressure on you. It's like, getting that tempo is more important than getting the extra point of damage or 2, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it sometimes it depends what type of deck you're playing, but I remember hearing Ben Dodd talk about the winner of the Calling Melbourne. Also, shout out to Ben. He's actually very close to top 8ing the most recent Pro Tour. I think he has like 1 win and a half or something. But he's explaining similar to that, for the way he liked to play Zuri is just kind of slowly march them down. So I don't mind if we're roughly even life totals. I just want to get you to that point where you're on like 5 or 6 life, And this is where I can really put you under pressure because now I have a lot of attack reactions. I have access to sort of pseudo dominate through things like isolate, and that's going to be how I get you in the end game. That's why I quite like sometimes when I see like one ofs or two ofs in deck lists. Like I don't want to get too much into deck building theory. There's obviously good arguments to say you don't play toolbox cards. Sometimes you do play toolbox. Sometimes you just want three ofs. But something I like to do back in the day when I played Rhinos, playing one yellow pummel. Um, when you get to things like top eights, Pro Tours, open deck lists, it doesn't help you out that much. But the theory behind this sometimes is like when I'm playing through Swiss and something like the national championships, it means that this card pitches to my club. It pitches to a lot of my two-cost attacks, like my Command and Conquers and stuff. But it also means that when you see me pitch a pummel at some point in the game, you're like, he's playing pummel. Like, this guy, I've seen him pitch pummel, he's playing pummel, which just means at some point in the game, I can do stuff like the classic Tunic play up. So I can go pitch a blue, I've got Tunic on 3 counters, play Command and Conquer, and now, I actually did this in one game where I was playing against a Katsu player, and he just goes like, oh, how many pummels in graveyard? I just say 0, you're welcome to check. Goes through, you haven't played any pummels yet, and I know you pitched 1 2 turns ago, like, how do I deal with this? And when you play back in that meta, if you block a CNC for 6 and you get pummeled, you get blown out, you lose your arsenal, you lose your hand, it's an absolute disaster. Absolute disaster. You've lost all tempo, you can't do anything. So just because of the fear of that, actually made a decision not to block and give up the plunder on an arsenal, which just meant their next turn wasn't very good and allows me to just get the small advantage to eventually win the game. Mm-hmm. So it's just little things like that I love in Fab. It's really cool.
Yeah, a little less on the perfect math side and a little more on the the psychology side, like making your opponent, forcing them to make a decision, and sometimes those decisions aren't going to be good. So this has been. I will say I do have to get going very soon here, and I'm hoping that this. I figure we might as well close it out before my OBS crashes again and just stops recording. Thankfully, it's been saving them. But I don't know why it's doing that issue this time. So Kieran, this has been absolutely fantastic. I'm really glad I got to talk to you. I mean, I know we met at Worlds briefly and got to talk a little bit, but it's been a very long time since then. And this has been, for me at least, and I hope for the audience out there, this has been very interesting because the early game meta is something when I started researching it, I got actually pretty interested by because it feels so different than how Flesh and Blood is today. Obviously, it's the very first set, even the first few sets. Like it's very different from how the game is today. So this has been an absolute wonderful time. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close it out here?
Not too much really. I'm super hyped for Partner Misfail coming out. I've been really enjoying seeing all the community reactions and the predictions of how things work. I think it's one of the coolest sets we've ever done. One of the best art sets and stuff we've ever done as well. So yeah, just pretty excited for that. Obviously, want to give a shout out to all the people involved, not only the players of the Pro Tour who gave us such an epic performance, but also the amazing cast production team. One of the, I think, best produced events that I've ever watched for Flesh and Blood. Really cool. And I know aside from that, I'm just getting hyped to watch the Calling Phuket this weekend. Can't wait to see how the meta develops. Is Dromai going to LL?
I hope so.
But yeah.
I like Dromai, but I like Prism more.
But that's pretty much it for me. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I like just sort of being involved in community stuff sometimes, so I'm always happy to jump on these sort of things. And yeah, it's thank you.
Okay, no, that's good to know, and thank you for coming on. I guess then you wouldn't mind if I ask you again sometime, because
Absolutely.
I don't mind bringing people back on. Yeah, no, this has been an absolute joy talking to you. It's really cool getting some insight, and maybe next time we could talk about like a set that's been released, and we can maybe discuss, like after, maybe even after what is it? Part of the Misfail. I either get you or I don't know, maybe Brian Gottlieb on again or maybe both. I don't know. We'll figure it out in the future. But this has been episode 59, and this has been Kieran
McIntyre?
No.
McIntyre, but also go by Mr. Classic. That always works as well.
Kieran from LSS, because like I'm sitting here reading it over my head, and yeah, it's I'm normally good like figuring out how to pronounce things, but for some reason yours is like causing me some issues. So
it's a tricky one. Got some of that Irish spelling in there.
It is because, like I said, I remember when I first asked you. For those who don't know, the way it's spelled, it looks like it's pronounced McEntigart, but it's McIntyre, correct?
Yep, you got it. You got it.
So I did have it. I thought like I was gonna say it, and I'm like, that might be wrong, and then I kind of fooled myself there. But this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you again for coming on, and for the rest of you, we will see you in the next one. Bye bye.
Catch you later.
If you like this video and wanted to support me, consider checking out my Patreon. There's extra bonuses like Talishar card sleeves, early access to videos, and even your own GigaChad card. And to those who are already supporting me, you have my undying thanks. It's because of Chads like you that I can continue to do what I do. So please, stay Chadly, my friends.